Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to the History Lost in Time podcast with part 2 of the Wilhelm Keitel Memoirs. Part 1 can be found in episode 25. Part 2 starts with the year 1941 and ends with Keitel's arrest in May 1945. I already said everything about the topic selection and the political background of this episode. Therefore, I will just get on with it without repeating this. Regarding the source, I also refer to episode 25. And apologies in advance if I sound a bit slurry. I'm still recovering from a tooth operation. I'm not drunk. For Wilhelm Keitel, the decisive event of 1941 was the beginning of the campaign against Russia. Keitel writes that Hitler already talked about the necessity to invade Russia in August 1940, so even before the Battle of Britain was over and long before the visit of Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs Molotov in Berlin in November 1940, which nowadays is considered to be a crucial moment in Soviet-German relations. Just like his publisher Werner Maser, Keitel is a supporter of the preventive war thesis. He claims that before the invasion, there were a lot of border violations by the Soviets and violent incidents with Soviet border troops. There is no historical evidence for this. On the contrary, Stalin was extremely cautious and didn't want to provoke Hitler to start a war. He feared that the British would try their best to pull him into their war with Hitler, and he did everything he could to avoid that. This isn't really that surprising. Being Hitler's neighbor in the years 1939 to 1941 wasn't exactly relaxing. Keitel presented three things that, in his mind, prove that the Germans attacked the Russians just a short time before the Russians would have attacked the Germans. 1. The massive build-up on Russia's western border. 2. Stalin's statements in 1940 that the idea of peace was over and now was the time to act. 3. The assumption that a Russian attack would have occurred in 1942. The Soviet build-up neither had a clear defensive nor a clear offensive character. It implemented elements of both strategies. This can be explained by the doctrine of the Red Army at the time. The plan was not to fight a defensive war, but to immediately launch a counterattack and to defeat the enemy on the enemy's territory. The Red Army tried this a few times during the summer of 1941 and suffered catastrophic casualties. Stalin's statements of 1939 and 1940 can be interpreted in many ways. On the one hand, they could simply be aimed at Finland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. There, the Soviet Union became active between 1939 and 41 and occupied territory. On the other hand, Stalin also meant the war in Western Europe with that. Just like France, he expected a repeat of the static fighting of World War I, at the end of which a Sovietization of Central and Western Europe would be possible. However, the quick victories of the Germans shattered this strategy, which caused great concern in the Kremlin, especially since the Soviet campaign against Finland did go so poorly. The assumption that a Soviet attack would happen in 1942 was based on intelligence service reports and the statements of captured Soviet officers. However, the foreign intelligence services of the Germans during World War II were catastrophically bad, so these estimates should not be taken seriously. And statements of captured Soviet soldiers cannot be taken at face value either. Soviet POWs were treated horribly by the Germans, so their statements can be considered at the same level as statements of torture victims. On top of that, Keitel didn't mention any names or dates regarding these statements. It feels like he was deliberately vague here. Keitel was opposed to Hitler's plans regarding a campaign in the East. However, Hitler rebuffed Keitel's arguments in a very brusque way, which caused Keitel to offer his resignation again. And just like before, Hitler refused to accept it. Again, Keitel offered his resignation because he couldn't take Hitler's brusque and derogatory way, not because of Hitler's plans. So why did Keitel oppose the campaign against Russia? In 1945-46 he wrote this for his attorney. Quote pages 291 and following. A. Given the fragmentation of our forces on land and in the air in the West, in Norway and in Africa, we are not strong enough to achieve a decisive victory against Russia's enormous war potential and the sheer size of the area in the short term. B. If, however, we fail to subdue Russia in the foreseeable future, we will be faced with the reality of a dangerous two-front war which will demand considerable forces in the West and which we will not be able to sustain, especially because Russia has material support from America. C. For England, such a tremendously strong new adversary of Germany would be a great relief. Active intervention by America would then be much more threatening and likely. Hitler gave the order to create a campaign plan already in late November or early December of 1940. From the start, the campaign had the character of a war of annihilation. According to his own statements, Keitel opposed this too. Quote, page 284. But I have never understood why it should be necessary to consciously and deliberately impose on this war from the outset the stamp of mutual extermination, of being or not being. On pages 284-285, he then admits his complicity. Quote, I confess to having been a tool of Hitler. As an apolitical and insufficiently critical soldier, I was no match for him, and thanks to my upbringing as an old-school officer, I was too obedient, even when refusal to obey would have been justified. At this point in the memoirs, it is remarkable how negatively Keitel talks about the Italians. He doesn't say anything good about them at all. According to Keitel, the Italians caused the loss of 6 weeks because of their adventure in the Balkans. Originally, the Russia campaign was to start in May of 1941. The short time between the campaigns in the Balkans and Russia meant that the Wehrmacht didn't have the time to properly secure the occupied territories. Hitler wanted to be really tough on Serbia, while he originally wanted to be generous with the Greeks. As we know today, things turned out to be different. Keitel also opposed the landing on Crete. He would have preferred an operation against Malta. Considering the future developments in North Africa, this would probably have been the better choice. In a very chaotic fashion, Keitel starts listing justifications and simply wrong statements in his memoirs. Example, on page 312 he claims that the British started the bombing campaigns against civilians in 1940. He doesn't mention German airstrikes on Warsaw, Rotterdam, London or Coventry. He's either deliberately not mentioning them or he really has no idea about these attacks. On page 315, the Commissar order is being discussed. This order stated that all political commissars should not be taken prisoner but executed immediately. While talking to the commander-in-chief of the army, Keitel was hoping that this topic would not create any written orders. Why would Keitel state this hope, unless he was totally clear on how criminal this order was and that such a document could one day become really dangerous to him? In the end, a written document was created because of this topic. It was released by the Wehrmacht High Command in May 1941 and signed by Keitel. Quote, page 317. Both orders, this one and the other concerning jurisdiction in Soviet Russia, have become the most serious burden in the Nuremberg trials, especially because they were issued 6 weeks before the war and therefore can never be based or justified by events during the war itself. This order clearly states that not only commissars but also partisans and other armed civilians have to be executed. Unit leaders had to ensure that all officers under their command knew about this order, so just ignoring it and keeping silent about it was forbidden. Time and again, Hitler made it clear during speeches and conversations that the war in the East should be fought with as much brutality as possible. Quote, page 327 and 328 regarding a Hitler speech in front of high-ranking officers. Hitler was imbued with the idea that his mission was to destroy communism before it could destroy us. He considered it completely impossible to make a lasting pact with communism in Russia. He spurned peace with the Western powers at any price and bet on war. He took on the two-front war because he underestimated Bolshevism and Stalin's state, as well as its reserves of strength, and in doing so, he destroyed the Third Reich he had created. Initially, the war in the East went quite well. The Red Army, weakened by Stalin's purges, attempted several uncoordinated counterattacks, but was time and again outmaneuvered, encircled, and annihilated. The Soviets were unable to keep up with the high speed of German operations. They also lost air supremacy quickly. The non-Russian civilians initially welcomed the Germans as liberators. However, due to the activities of the Einsatzkommandos and the German occupation regime, these friendly civilians quickly became fierce enemies. Quote page 328. Hitler believed as early as the end of July 1941 that not only had the Red Army been defeated, but that the core of Russian military strength was also so severely hit that even a reconstruction of the Red Army would no longer save it from complete destruction. Thus, at the end of July or the beginning of August, he ordered the conversion of the most essential parts of our armament. Tanks were an exception, but otherwise a significant increase in armament production for the Navy, submarines, and the Air Force, aircraft and anti-aircraft guns, was ordered. More and more, Hitler started talking about small details regarding military operations, thus extending briefings into infinity. And time and again, Keitel was sent out to transmit orders or to clarify questions that had nothing to do with the Wehrmacht High Command. Keitel explains that with Hitler's chaotic way of living and working. Quote page 332. Both my adjutants and I could name countless cases in which visitors, letters, and phone calls harassed me with stereotypical justifications. The Führer referred me to you, or you should announce the following to the Wehrmacht. Wehrmacht meant Wehrmacht High Command to all these outsiders, and Wehrmacht High Command meant Keitel to them. But could I have replied in the briefing if Hitler had personally assigned me such tasks in front of an audience of 25? My Führer, that's none of my business, tell your secretary? Could the men who were present at Hitler's presentation, when instructed to speak to me first, have responded with, "We won't do that, Keitel will throw us out"? Things weren't that simple after all. It wasn't my good nature or stupidity that was to blame. The system was flawed. At this point, Keitel stresses that he was an office general without a field command. Quote pages 332-333. After all, in World War II, I was a field marshal and couldn't give orders to anyone except the Wehrmacht High Command, my driver, and my assistant. By late summer of 1941, there was friction between Hitler and the Army High Command. While Hitler wanted to focus on economic goals of war in Ukraine and southern Russia, the Army High Command wanted to conquer the political center of the Soviet Union, Moscow. The problem is that both goals were legitimate and fundamentally correct. Germany was only able to do well in the campaigns of 39 and 40 because it received large quantities of resources from the Soviet Union. Without such resources, a modern war could not be waged. However, conquering such resources would not defeat an enemy like the Soviet Union because it had plenty of more resources in areas far away from the front lines. The idea of the Army High Command to conquer Moscow is also a good one. The loss of Moscow would have been a major political and organizational blow to the Soviet Union. On the other hand, Napoleon conquered Moscow in 1812 and still lost the war. In case the Germans had taken Moscow, Soviet propaganda would have been able to use this precedent. It is questionable whether focusing on one of these goals would have led to success. In the end, the Wehrmacht tried to achieve both goals, first to conquer the resources, then Moscow. In the end, neither goal was achieved. The situation in the occupied territories in the rest of Europe also became critical. Quote page 335. During the summer of 1941, the situation in all theaters of war deteriorated noticeably due to the rebelliousness of the civilian population, acts of sabotage, and attacks on Wehrmacht personnel and facilities. Keitel mentions Yugoslavia, France, and Belgium, and supply drops from Britain. There were calls for more police and more garrisons from everywhere. Hitler reacted with brutality and recklessness in order to quell the unrest. Some of these orders were signed by Keitel. Keitel uses a couple of pages to justify these orders. According to him, they were necessary to demonstrate to the German soldier that chivalry was not possible in this war. He claims that this type of war was created by the British intelligence service and that it was illegal. He calls it the illegal war in the dark. Here he is either playing dumb or he really doesn't know how things truly were in the occupied territories. One cannot expect anything but resistance from an occupied and oppressed population. The Nazi leadership expected nothing else from the Germans by the end of the war. In July 1941, one of Keitel's sons died in a field hospital because of wounds he had received during a strafing run from enemy aircraft. This was a major blow to both the field marshal and the entire family. Since the war in the East started, the Army High Command managed this campaign, while the commanding officers of the other theaters of war reported directly to Hitler via the Wehrmacht High Command. Therefore, these other theaters of war were called Wehrmacht High Command theaters of war, even though Keitel disliked this term. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 took Hitler by surprise. Apparently, he hadn't known about it in advance. Japan did not consult him. However, he was kind of relieved, since he could now turn the state of half-war with the US into a real war. The Soviet counteroffensive in the winter of 1941-42 put enormous pressure on the Wehrmacht. Keitel says that it was Hitler who managed to prevent a collapse of the front lines. Many historians agree with that statement nowadays. Keitel explains why the no-step-back order was necessary. Quote pages 354-355. Within a few days, the mud period had given way to an infernal cold, which then rose to over minus 40 degrees Celsius in the Moscow area, with all the catastrophic consequences for the troops already mentioned. There was a lack of winter clothing for the soldiers and of anti-freeze for military equipment, especially for tanks and vehicles. The oil froze, the machine guns failed, and so on. The daily departures from the front due to frostbite reached a frightening level. Worst of all, however, was that in addition to the breakdown of motor vehicles, the railways also failed completely. The locomotives froze, as did the water stations. In this situation, Hitler's first order to the Eastern Front on December 19, 1941 was "stand still." Not a step back was the only right decision. It reflected the realization that retreating, even by a few kilometers, would mean the loss of all heavy weapons, which had sunk into the mud and had become literally frozen solid and immobile, but also the fact that the loss of the heavy weapons would have left the troops hopelessly lost and defenseless on the run. Not to mention that the guns, anti-tank guns and vehicles, could not be replaced either. Keitel repeatedly points out how important it would have been to have a real commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht. However, the Hitler system promoted side-by-side and against each other structures of competing institutions and people, which led to conflicts and friction losses. Keitel found himself at the center of these conflicts a lot. Quote, page 351. Everyone referred to an alleged Führer order or authorization. In cases of conflict, contradiction, or arbitrary actions, however, it was the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command who had to act as mediator or arbitrator, or as the always available mouthpiece of the Führer, whose final decision he had to convey, even though he naturally could not have and did not have an independent judgment in these areas. Keitel was also often used as a sort of lightning rod for Hitler's outbreaks, especially when they were aimed against individuals. When General Halder became the new chief of staff of the Army High Command, and with that Hitler's direct contact to the Army High Command, Keitel claims that he tried to support him and strengthen his position as best as he could. Quote, page 354. It was in my own interest, after all, because I was the one who always had to hear the consequences of the latent crises of confidence, and had to pay the price, which I gradually grew tired of, just as I was then the target of Hitler's insults against others who, in his opinion, deserved it, because he no longer liked the face of this or that general. Starting in 1942, Keitel was facing increasing problems with staff recruitment. There simply were not enough people to fill all positions within the army, the Luftwaffe, the navy, the Waffen-SS, and the armaments industry. The problem could not be solved. And since the Waffen-SS and certain institutions managed to reserve the best people for themselves, the Wehrmacht was forced to fill its ranks with people that were not first class. On top of that, the German forces were facing a permanent supply problem. Trains were the backbone of logistics, and they never managed to completely supply the troops with what they actually needed. On page 365, Keitel says that the army, without the Luftwaffe, required 120 trains of supply each day, but only received at best 100 trains a day, often less than that. That means that supplies were always scarce. In autumn of 1942, there was a major crisis between Hitler and the chief of the operations staff, Alfred Jodl, which I already mentioned in episode 5. Jodl flew to the commanding officer of the Caucasus forces in order to get him to keep on advancing. However, the local commander said that further advances were impossible, and Jodl agreed with him. When Jodl returned to Hitler and told him that, Hitler exploded with rage. Both Jodl and Keitel had to listen to a lot of stuff that day. This was the third time Keitel offered his resignation, and again, not because of what Hitler did, but because of how he talked to him and treated him. The 1942 offensive could only take place at the southern part of the Eastern Front due to a shortage of soldiers and weapons. The central and northern parts of the front were more or less put to sleep. Again, the Soviets suffered losses and had to abandon territory, but they had adapted to the fighting style of the Wehrmacht. Quote, page 370. The Russians' conduct of combat during the major offensive in the south also had a new character. The number of prisoners taken remained relatively low compared to previous encirclement battles. The enemy evaded the threat of encirclement in good time and, in a strategic defensive position, exploited the vastness of the area, which meant avoiding a devastating decision. Only in and around Stalingrad and at the mountain entrances did they offer the most stubborn resistance, because operational encirclement was no longer to be feared. Due to the overstretched front lines, the Germans were only able to attack at certain individual points. Quote, page 371. The enormous expenditure of force, which could not be repeated, was no longer proportionate to the small expenditure of force it had cost the Russians so far. The Chief of Staff of the Army High Command, Halder, was replaced with Zeitzler, but this rotation at the top did not change the situation in the east. As is well known, the German offensive collapsed in November 1942, both at Stalingrad and the Caucasus. According to Keitel, an outbreak at Stalingrad would have been possible, but only directly after the encirclement of the troops. This would, however, have meant to abandon Stalingrad completely. Once the encirclement had consolidated itself, an outbreak was no longer possible. Any plans regarding a breakthrough in December 1942 or January 1943 were unrealistic. Supplies from the Luftwaffe were insufficient, and the counter-offensive was too weak. He calls the drama of the Sixth Army his most horrific memories. Quote, page 375. I can say, however, that no amount of effort, no amount of deprivation, and no amount of sacrifice on the part of all involved could compensate for an operational error that was attributable to the failure of the top leadership. Abandoning Stalingrad would certainly have meant a serious loss of prestige, but the lost army and the situation created by its loss produced a setback that amounted to a lost campaign for 1942-43. For me, there would have been only one solution in the situation that had arisen to counter the impending loss of the Eastern Campaign: a strategic retreat to the shortest possible front line, utilizing natural obstacles from the Black Sea or the Carpathians to Lake Peipus. Expanding such a front as a defensive position, fortifying it, and holding it with the remaining available forces would, in my opinion, have been achievable. Unfortunately, this is the point where Keitel's notes regarding the years 1941 to 43 end. He didn't have the time to complete them. Instead, he jumped forward to April 1945 in order to describe the final days of the war. He finished this description 6 days before his execution. After that, there was no time to fill any gaps. On April 20th, 1945, Keitel witnessed the last large-scale Western airstrike on Berlin. There was no German air defense left, and the bomb drops happened like during a large peacetime training mission. Keitel initially expected Hitler to retreat to Berchtesgaden in the so-called Alpine Redoubt, and he often tried to convince Hitler to do this. Many that were close to Hitler did this. However, Keitel and the others achieved nothing, as Hitler had his mind set on dying in Berlin. Everything that had to be evacuated to Berchtesgaden had already been taken there, and evacuation aircraft were on standby around the clock. The idea was that the head of the Navy, Admiral Dönitz, would lead the forces in the north, Hitler would lead in the south, and coordination would happen via radio transmissions. Keitel evacuated his family to the south of Germany. General Schörner, the commanding officer of the German forces around the Czech Republic, still had a more or less intact formation, and that's what Hitler was hoping for. The rest of the Eastern Front consisted of decimated, worn out, and hopelessly shattered forces. On page 380, Keitel called the situation in the West and Italy hopeless. Hitler seemed to oscillate between hopelessness and hopefulness himself. Keitel blamed the generals that reported to him that they whitewashed the situation and by that helped to feed Hitler's false hopes. Quote page 381. But even in this case, the Führer's self-deception which he displayed was further encouraged by the generals he still trusted, and they fed him with hopes that were disastrous. As Jodl and I drove back together in my car in the evening as usual to assess the situation, we were astonished that the Führer seemed so hopeful, or at least expressed himself so confidently. Schörner and Wenck must have encouraged him. Did he really not see the hopelessness of the situation? Yes, he did, but he didn't want to acknowledge it. During a conversation with Hitler, both Jodl and Keitel urged Hitler to head for the south, otherwise leading state or Wehrmacht was no longer possible. In turn, Hitler ordered them to leave Berlin, which they refused to do. Hitler didn't react to that at all. Instead he said, quote page 383, "I'm staying here, that's for sure. I have deliberately committed myself, without your knowledge, by making a public announcement. Negotiations with the enemy must now take place, and Göring is better at that than I am anyway. Either I win the Battle of Berlin, or I fall in Berlin. That is my irrevocable decision." It is extraordinary to hear that Hitler talked about negotiations with the Allies here. Other than that, all of this fits to his general behavior in the last year of the war. Since late summer of 1944, Minister of Propaganda Goebbels had urged Hitler to hold a public speech on German radio. However, Hitler first wanted to win a major battle, so he could present some success to the German people. First, this was supposed to be the Battle of the Bulge, and when that failed, it had to be the Battle of Berlin. Keitel and Jodl considered this to be madness, so they planned their own retreat towards Berchtesgaden. They also considered to transfer Hitler there by force. Keitel started commuting between the Führerbunker and the Wenck army that operated west of Berlin in order to keep in touch with Wenck and tell him what to do. These drives became increasingly difficult. On page 387, Keitel describes a conversation with Hitler that took place on April 23, 1945, during which he ultimately asked how things should now continue. Then I explained that I wanted to know whether he, Hitler, had initiated negotiations with the enemy powers and who would conduct them. After initially stating that it was still early enough for surrender, he then tried to explain to me that negotiations could always be held once any success had been achieved, and that was Berlin. When I wasn't satisfied with that, he said that he had been conducting negotiations with England via Italy for some time, and that he had summoned Ribbentrop today for further steps. He couldn't tell me anything more at the moment. He would under no circumstances lose his nerve. That was his final word on the matter today and for the time being. I also said that I would contact him again the next day after returning from the front and explain the situation to him. Then I left, unaware that this had been my last meeting with Hitler. As far as I know, no such negotiations with England via Italy actually took place. In his last days, Hitler told a lot of untrue things to a lot of people just to get rid of them. He had already planned his suicide. Keitel and Jodl again discussed the idea to transfer Hitler by force to Berchtesgaden. However, due to the strong SS guard detail, the SD in the bunker and people like the head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, Martin Bormann, and General Burgdorf, they considered this to be impossible. During Keitel's next drive to the Wenck army, Berlin was encircled, so it was impossible for him to return to Berlin. The headquarters of the Wehrmacht High Command was no longer in Berlin, but had to be withdrawn further towards the north every few days. Keitel now commuted between this new headquarters and the Wenck army while trying to get to Berlin via aircraft. He attempted this multiple times, but all flights were cancelled. The only connection with the Führerbunker was now a radio-based voice connection. Starting on April 24th, the briefings of the Wehrmacht High Command were held and organized by Keitel. After the briefings, he called Hitler and reported to him. On the one hand, Keitel considered the overall situation to be hopeless. On the other hand, however, he still saw some potential for minor gains, for example the attack of the Steiner group, that he thought might actually work. This attack was supposed to solve or at least improve the situation around Berlin, but in the end it had no effect. When he heard about Göring's removal from all positions, Keitel was very surprised, especially since the plan had been for Dönitz to lead in the north and Göring to lead in the south, once Berlin had been encircled. Quote, page 392. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, because this move by the Führer revealed to me a shocking picture of the mood in the Reichschancellery, and the disastrous actions of Martin Bormann. Only he could have had his infamous fingers in the game here, and taking advantage of the Führer's state of mind, finally decide his intrigue against Göring in his favor. On April 26, Dönitz, head of the SS Himmler, Jodl and Keitel met in the Wehrmacht High Command headquarters. The fact that the Americans had stopped at the river Elbe and that Schörner was able to hold his position south of Berlin gave them a little hope. They parted by promising to each other to do everything that could be done to help Berlin. On April 28th, the voice radio connection between the Wehrmacht High Command and the Führerbunker, which relied on a balloon, collapsed after Russian aircraft had shot down that balloon. The only thing left was a text-based radio connection with Berlin. In the evening of April 28th, the Wehrmacht High Command received the last radio transmission from Hitler with the following questions. Quote, page 398. 1. What is the situation of Army Group Vistula? 2. What is the status of the Steiner Panzer Corps attack? 3. What do you know about the 9th Army? No connection here. 4. Where is the 12th Army, Wenck? When will it attack via Potsdam? 5. What is the Holste Corps doing? I truthfully and without embellishment reported the seriousness of the situation and the hopelessness of enabling the liberation of Berlin at this time. I wrote at the bottom of the report, relief of Berlin and reopening of access from the west are no longer to be hoped for. I propose a breakout via Potsdam to Wenck, otherwise the Führer's departure to the southern area, awaiting a decision. At midnight, the new head of the Luftwaffe, Field Marshal Greim, and test pilot Hanna Reitsch arrived at the Wehrmacht High Command headquarters. Both were more or less the last ones to escape from Berlin via aircraft, even though Greim had been wounded by ground fire. There was no reply from Berlin. By April 30th, the Wehrmacht High Command had relocated to Neustadt in the Lübeck Bay via Wismar and held contact to Dönitz, who was located at Plön. During this retreat, both Keitel and the Wehrmacht High Command saw a wild mix of civilian refugees and fleeing shattered soldiers, all of which were heading west. Keitel attempted to organize the chaos, but he was unsuccessful. Twice he was attacked by British aircraft on strafing runs, but he remained uninjured. Dönitz told Keitel that Hitler had named Dönitz his successor. One day later, he told Keitel that Hitler was dead. In his last will, Hitler had appointed the ministers of the new government, thus trying to shape the structure of the government after his death. Quote page 400. So it was over. The Führer had taken his own life, according to Goebbels' words. Otherwise, it would have been fallen and not died. The will, which was supposedly to be delivered by an officer via plane, had not arrived. Dönitz immediately expressed the view that as his successor as head of state, he would under no circumstances allow himself to be dictated to a cabinet and a list of ministers. I could only agree with this, as fully justified, and stated that this was clearly an attempt by Goebbels and Bormann to present him, Dönitz, with a fait accompli. Himmler, who had been stripped of power by Hitler shortly before his suicide, suddenly showed up and considered himself to be an obvious member of the new government. However, Dönitz strongly disagreed. Both Dönitz and Keitel considered Himmler to be an absolutely unacceptable member of the future government, and they told him as much. Himmler disagreed, but after a few days he realized that he wasn't wanted anymore. He said that he would disappear for at least half a year. As is well known, he was captured just a few weeks later and killed himself with poison. On May 2nd, Keitel and Jodl discussed what should be done now. Quote page 401. We both had only one thought: to end the war as quickly as possible, as soon as the evacuation of East Prussia and the rescue of as large a part of the Eastern Army as possible would allow it. Since the front lines in Italy had collapsed and the German forces in the Balkans were in serious danger, Dönitz also wanted to end the war as quickly as possible. On May 2nd, everyone, the government and the Wehrmacht High Command, retreated to Flensburg. During the negotiations with the Western powers, it became obvious that the Wehrmacht would almost get no time at all to save the troops in the east. With a little delay tactics and by hinting towards the bad communication lines, they managed to organize time until May 8th, 9th. On May 8th, Keitel used an English cargo aircraft to fly to Berlin. There, the Allies let Keitel wait for 10 hours. The ceremony to sign the surrender only took place around midnight. Keitel describes this ceremony briefly. Little details that are pointed out nowadays, like that he had to come to the document instead of it being brought to him, are not mentioned by him at all. Apparently the victors considered these little things to be way more important than him. Also, the fact that the French were present as well is not mentioned by him. Instead, he writes that after the ceremony, the Russians presented a very large meal to him and his companions. For the first time in weeks, they were all able to eat their fill. The next morning, the Russians wanted to delay his return flight. However, he insisted that he had to leave in order to transmit these surrender orders. The impression he got from the totally destroyed Berlin was horrible to him. In Flensburg, he found a new situation. The Dönitz government now had Western liaison officers at its side. On May 13th, Keitel was told that he had to transfer his duties to Jodl and that he should consider himself a prisoner of war now. He was then brought to Luxembourg by aircraft. His memoirs close with the following words, quote page 410. In Flensburg, I drove to the airfield in my own car, still completely free. In those 2 hours, I could have ended my life, completely unguarded. However, I didn't think about it because I didn't believe such a path of suffering leading to the tragic end in Nuremberg was possible. On May 13, 1945, I became a prisoner of war in Mondorf. Since August 13, 1945, I have been in a prison cell in Nuremberg, and on October 16, 1946, I await the execution of my death sentence. Completed on October 10, 1946. The French wanted to have Keitel shot. Keitel and his wife asked for the same. However, the court denied this. Like all others that were sentenced to death, he was hanged. His final words before the execution were, quote from page 411, I call upon the Almighty to have mercy on the German people. Over 2 million German soldiers have died for the fatherland before me. I follow my sons. Everything for Germany. Attached to the memoirs are a few documents that Keitel wrote. In one of them he mentions that Hitler was very disappointed that the Wehrmacht leadership, still under the influence of personal World War experiences, was opposed to a new war and time and again tried to delay the inevitable in order to improve the Wehrmacht first. Keitel also briefly talks about two domestic policy issues in these documents. Quote page 426. Like the entire General Staff, I was fundamentally opposed to the measures against the churches. I am a devout Christian and in positions of responsibility as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Blomberg and later as Chief of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, I ensured that the Wehrmacht chaplaincy was maintained. The contrast to party political issues became particularly sharp in the Jewish question. As I have demonstrated as Chief of Staff to the then Reich Minister of War and Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht von Blomberg, I took a stand against the defamation of World War I veterans of the Jewish faith. I also repeatedly and successfully interceded on behalf of Jewish World War I veterans to the Führer in individual complaints. Marriages of soldiers with so-called half-Jews, whose approval was personally granted by the Führer, were handled generously. That's basically all that Keitel said regarding domestic policy issues, but one has to admit that he wasn't dealing with those, so he isn't individually to blame here, but rather is part of the collective guilt of responsibility, which Albert Speer mentioned during the trial. In a draft for his closing statement of the trial, which was not used, Keitel again insisted on just following orders, that the Wehrmacht High Command and him personally did not have any power over individual Wehrmacht units, and that, in his opinion, the Wehrmacht had committed no crimes. He blamed everything on Hitler. In a personal note, he mentioned that out of his 5 children, 1 son had fallen, 1 was missing, and that 1 daughter had died as a result of injuries sustained during an airstrike. On top of that, all his belongings had been destroyed, and his wife had been separated from him since the end of the war. In a final wish, he asked the court not to punish his family or his Wehrmacht High Command co-workers for anything that he was accused of. In the closing statement that he did actually use, he tried to explain the things that the prosecution had accused him of. He closed with the following words, quote page 438. My defense attorney asked me 2 fundamental questions during the proceedings. The first months ago was, if you had won, would you have refused to have played a part in the success? I answered no. I would certainly have been proud. The second question was, how would you behave if you found yourself in the same situation again? My answer, then I would rather choose death than allow myself to be drawn into the net of such pernicious methods. From these 2 answers may the High Court recognize my judgment. I believed I was mistaken and was unable to prevent what should have been prevented. That is my fault. It is tragic to have to realize that the best I had to offer as a soldier, obedience and loyalty, was exploited for unknown purposes, and I failed to see that even the fulfillment of a soldier's duty has its limits. That is my fate. May this clear realization regarding the causes, the disastrous methods, and the terrible consequences of this war give rise to hope for a new future for the German people in the community of nations. A few finishing words. At the end of this second Mammoth episode, I want to make something very clear. These are memoirs, not the truth. Like in all memoirs, we can find whitewashing, omissions, and untruths. Therefore, one shouldn't consider these memoirs to be the whole truth. However, what is important about memoirs is the fact that they allow you to get into the mind and thoughts of an individuum. As much as the authors of memoirs try to omit unpleasant things, their personality is revealed. In the case of Wilhelm Keitel, this is a weak person that was exploited by Hitler and that did everything that Hitler asked for. At the same time, however, it is also a person that at the end of his life realized that he was exploited and that also realized that he was too weak to defend himself, that he helped to lead himself, his family, and his nation into ruin. A person that literally and figuratively tried to get his head out of the noose with arguments like, I only followed orders and I had no power, I was just an office general. One realizes that Keitel was a very straight-line person, one might also say stubborn or dull-witted, and that he didn't care about anything outside his own personal sphere of existence. Someone that, at the end of his life, looked in horror at the things he hadn't known or hadn't wanted to know. In my personal opinion, due to his personality, Wilhelm Keitel was unsuited to fulfill such an important position within the Wehrmacht. In the end, he saw it the same way, as is apparent from the quotes. I assume that Hitler already realized that in the mid-1930s, and that's why he put Keitel on the position of head of the Wehrmacht High Command. Someone like Keitel couldn't be a danger to him, act independently, or undermine him. In episode 13, I said that I had problems when it came to the question whether the death penalty was appropriate for Keitel. After reading his memoirs, I have to say I still have problems with that. Guilty? Yes. But death penalty? I just don't know. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.